Alright, YouTube, prefacing this video with the Iranian nuclear deal, I think it's time to talk about what the United States' relationship is specifically with the State of Israel. Because a lot of people appear to believe that the relationship between the US and Israel is currently going sour, but that somehow magically before Obama's second term we were the best of buddies. We were bosom buddies, best of friends. They were our greatest ally in some manner. We were, just absolutely indispensable to one another in some way. This is not the case. I hate to break it to people, but the State of Israel has been at best a strategic trading partner with the United States for most of its existence. There was a time when the United States largely did support Israel unilaterally. It did so because it observed it being attacked way back when we're talking, JFK and Nixon era, and naturally came to its aid, gave it money, gave it weapons, and so forth. However, since that time, the nation of Israel has done basically everything that it can to undermine the United States, to undermine our foreign policy, for one thing, to undermine our security, to undermine our integrity with our defense initiatives and so forth. It's done a lot of stuff, and it's really beginning to piss people off. Now, those that criticize Israel typically get labeled either somehow they're Islam friendly or they're Nazis, which is generally not the case. Most people currently who are saying it's time to rethink our relationship with Israel fall into one of several relatively static categories. I happen to fall into the first. I don't single out Israel. I say the United States has a lot of budget problems right now. We don't really need to be sending billions of dollars of aid to a nation that claims to be God's chosen people, capable of fending for itself. It's a nuclear state. There's no reason that we need to be sending them so much as a red cent, nor should we be sending money to Saudi Arabia, which we already prop up through oil sales, Pakistan, another nuclear state that is thinking of selling nuclear materials to the Saudi Arabians. How the fuck are we supporting their government? We send money to all sorts of different regimes across the world. The funny thing is, the ones we're not giving money are our actual close allies. You'd think we'd be funding development in NATO countries, or, countries that are part of the Reciprocal Defense Treaty of the Americas, or part of one of our Asian treaties. You'd think we'd be helping them out. Instead, we appear to be throwing money into these states in the Middle East for no reason, to the tune of many tens of billions of dollars a year that we don't really have. We've got a deficit. We're deeply in debt. Why are we paying anybody at this point? There are a very small number of states that we should actually be sending any money to at all. Some close ally gets hit with a disaster, can't cope with it on their own. Yeah, go ahead and bankroll them. As far as a state that is not currently suffering a 10.0 earthquake or a super volcanic eruption or something, they don't need our money. They've got their own government. They've got their own productivity. Let them sort out their own budget. They're capable of doing that. We've also been giving free weapons to many of these countries. Why aren't we selling them? Why are we giving them free weapons at all? Congress just said, oh, well, we'll give a few thousand more missiles to the Israelis. They've got plenty of missiles anyway. They manufacture a lot of their own arms. They don't need it. Another group is tired of hearing about the xenophobia and racism in the State of Israel. It's very funny because here you have the Jewish homeland, the Jewish state, and yet one of the primary concerns about that state is they are acting a bit like the Third Reich, or at least apartheid-era South Africa. Now, there's an interesting connection with South Africa as far as their nuclear program goes. And that's the other concern. There are also people who are simply concerned because they're warmongers. They see the bombing of Gaza. They see attacks on the West Bank and the disputed settlements that every country on earth have said, yeah, it's illegal. It's against it's ethnocide. They're forcing people off land that does not belong to the State of Israel. I've argued with people who say, oh, well, Israel's so generous they unilaterally gave Gaza to the Palestinians. It was never Israeli to begin with. It was already part of Palestine. You can't give somebody something that was already theirs. You can withdraw from it and stop directly occupying it, but as long as you're still bombing it, you haven't really given it back anyway. There's a 2-mile wide no-go zone all the way around the Israeli border with Gaza that the Gazans can't even make use of. It's basically a wasteland. Looks like something from Fallout. If you ever want to play Fallout in real life, just go to the the Gaza Strip, all it is a bunch of bombed out buildings. I've seen plenty of live feeds. Most of the buildings there are in shambles. It looks far worse than like a post-Soviet sort of crumbled Eastern European economy with a bunch of slab tenements that are slowly falling in on themselves. And a nation like Macedonia looks like a shining example of the first world compared to the Gaza Strip. I've had people try to claim to me, oh, the Palestinians are one of the most obese, well-fed people in the world. They take in an average of however many calories a day. When you try to point out to them that that study was done long before Israel began its yearly bombing campaigns on Gaza, destroying most of their infrastructure, of course, they completely ignore you. And then they pretend that they won the argument only to forget all about the argument that was just had. But that goes beyond the U.S.-Israeli relationship. I'm just simply pointing out why people would be concerned about the nation of Israel. It's a money sponge. It acts a bit genocidal, let's face it, towards the Palestinians and towards some of its other regional neighbors. Not so much like the Egyptians and Jordanians, but the Lebanese, the Syrians certainly, and definitely those that are in Palestine. I think, of course, the Lebanese and the Syrians are Shia, and so that may be a little bit different than the Sunnis in Egypt and Jordan, who apparently are the best friends with Israel now. The Jordanians are their greatest ally, not the United States, I suppose. Anyways, Israel, many, many years ago, stole a great deal of nuclear material from the United States. Now, let's ask ourselves this. Does this sound like the behavior of one ally towards another when it steals hundreds of tons of highly enriched uranium from you? I would argue no. What about when they steal your weapons plans and your plans of other types, technological materials, and sell them to the Chinese? Does that sound like an ally to you and a strong ally of the United States? Because that's exactly what the state of Israel's done on several different occasions. The Pentagon has said, oh yeah, of all of our allies, the Israelis are spying on us the most. Little tiny Israel has more spies in the United States than any other nation. The Chinese don't spy on us as much as Israel does, which is very strange. They conduct a great deal of espionage on a nation that has given them hundreds of billions of dollars. Most of their weapons come from the United States. They're free U.S. surplus. We've never made them pay back a cent. We've given them all sorts of aid. We've propped them up in the UN for decades now, and that's how they repay us. Okay. As far as the South Africa connection goes, that's actually rather interesting. The Israeli state has consistently pursued what is called nuclear ambiguity. That is, everybody kind of knew that they had nuclear weapons, but the Israeli state never admitted it, and they never brought it up. They didn't want to admit, yes, they had them, or deny, no, we don't have them. Because their policy, the idea of nuclear ambiguity, is to keep your enemies not knowing whether you have nukes or not, so they won't dare to attack you. Meanwhile, you may have very few or no nuclear weapons at all, and thus, you don't have to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Well, isn't that great for Israel? They are a nuclear state that has not signed the NPT, yet scares the shit out of their enemies, and they've got the backing of the United States and large parts of the Western world, despite the fact that they haven't signed the NPT. Now, here's where the South African connection comes in. When Israel obtained stolen uranium and nuclear triggers from the United States, it could not test a nuclear weapon. It had its own designs, of course, that it manufactured. They were the ones that designed their own weapon styles. But how do you go about testing a nuclear weapon when you don't want to have to either admit that you have them and sign the NPT, and you'd be forced at that point to sign the NPT, and you also don't want people to know whether you have them in the first place because you're simply pursuing a policy of ambiguity. You don't want people to know you have them, and you don't want people to be aware if you don't. Therefore, you have to have some other nation test your nuclear weapon for you. Well, who tested a single nuclear weapon that was kind of under strange, dubious circumstances, sort of unannounced, in an area that is infrequently traveled, and it was all very, very strange? Oh, the nation of South Africa. You see, the nation of South Africa developed nuclear weapons long ago. It destroyed its stockpile. They decided they didn't want to have nuclear weapons anymore. They tested one nuclear weapon there has always been the suspicion that they did it jointly with the Israelis. Here's what I think happened. I think when the Israelis stole U.S. uranium and nuclear triggers, they realized they had a lot of this material. They didn't really need much of it. You only really need 10 or 20 nuclear warheads to completely wipe out all the areas surrounding Israel. The Samson option, of course. Therefore, they stole a lot more uranium than they needed for such a thing, so simply they gave a lot of it to South Africa and said, hey, we'll give you all these free nuke goodies, and here's some cash, and maybe diplomatic, maybe we'll convince the United States not to crack down on you for being a communist regime at the time. Test this weapon for us, and everything's good. South Africans pretend to develop their own nuclear weapons, which were really from Israeli plans. Test the weapon. At the time, of course, many nations totally unaware it went on. People slowly realize there was a nuclear test. They assume it's South Africa. Then the sneaking suspicion, of course, sinks in that it was also Israeli involved. But there's no paper trail leading back to the Israelis. They probably just loaded a sub with some of these weapons and some of this material and sent it to South Africa and then came right back. They didn't give a fuck because they had plenty of material. They simply needed to know that their nuclear design worked. So they test the weapon, and then later on, what appears to be the case is either the Israelis paid them off to do away with their stockpile and just gave them a huge lump of U.S. money or something like that, or the South Africans just decided, well, you know, we already got everything we wanted out of the deal. We got all these nukes lying around. We can't fucking take care of them. We don't even want nukes. Let's just destroy them, and it'll give us some credit on the world stage for being a nuclear state that unilaterally disarms nuclear weapons. Yay, we win again. So either way, the Israelis got to test their early nuclear design at the time. And now, of course, we know they have nuclear weapons. The Pentagon's own report that was FOIA'd from the 80s states that the nuclear program of Israel was at least as advanced as that of the United States at that point. That is, they were working on various weapons designs, did have enriched material, but where did that material come from? You think the Israelis obtained it from the Australians without the United States knowing? Or they obtained it, they actually paid the U.S. for it? What would be the point? You'd be canceling out the aid that you're getting. No, they stole it. They stole U.S. uranium. Thus, it was free. They didn't have to worry about getting rid of most of it and putting it in South Africa. They didn't care. They only needed, at most, a few dozen weapons. I personally think that the 200 warhead total, usually spoken of, vastly overblows the Israeli nuclear arsenal. I think it's probably 50 or less, specifically because a lot of that material was either apparently tested or in a stock in South Africa and it was overseen internationally that it was destroyed. Therefore, that material, which I assume was probably from Israel, could not have been used for it. It was destroyed, so it obviously wasn't used for weapons, and probably the Israelis took some of it and turned it into nuclear fuel for their own nuclear plants or something like that. So we don't know necessarily how many systems they have, but I think 200 would be a little bit much. Even with all the aid they get, I don't think the Israeli state could, number one, hide that much material, and number two, actually maintain it. I think that'd be a bit of a stretch. They'd be using most of their budget, most of their aid for that. And obviously they have acquired a large number of conventional weapons, even weapons that we're not actually gifting to them as well. But look at like the USS Liberty incident, where the Israeli Air Force attacked a U.S. vessel that was clearly marked, identified itself over the radio. There was no response and it got attacked anyway. That's not the action of an ally. That was quite some time ago. It was just idling off the coast of Egypt when it got attacked. It had a U.S. flag on it. The people were speaking English. They weren't speaking Arabic. It still got attacked somehow. Then they claimed, it was a mistake, but the people involved still got awards for their exercise, I suppose. There's been all sorts of espionage. The Rosenbergs, a couple of Jewish individuals in the 1940s that stole U.S. atomic designs and gave them to the Soviets, thus starting the entire Cold War. It's an old married couple that happened to do that. I'm sure they were considered heroes for preventing a nationalistic United States from becoming too expansionist or something like that, sort of cracking the world in half or something. You look at the Iran deal. The new Iran deal is proof positive. The Israeli state is so paranoid about Iran that even their own intelligence services have said is incapable of weaponizing uranium and will be incapable of doing so for quite some time. Even if they attempted to weaponize it, they'd fail at this point. Their own intelligence services said that, and yet they're so paranoid about it, they're actually attempting to usurp the US government in its efforts to secure a deal with the Iranians that most of the other countries in the world have signed on to. You see, the problem is this. Evangelicals in the United States, and it's almost always the US and only a handful in like Europe or anywhere else, have this fixation on declaring the state of Israel somehow chosen, somehow special, above reproach or something. That makes no sense whatsoever. They're not even a religiously led state. They're a secular state. The state of Israel is essentially an atheistic state. An atheistic, socialistic state that nonetheless has severe right-wing views when it comes to intermarriage and race and things like that and how they treat their neighbors. They're an exceptionally jingoistic nation, which is why some people on the right-leaning libertarians, want to stop giving them money, specifically because they're attempting to undermine the U.S. government's own approach. Now, I am not a fan of Obama. I don't generally like Obama. I think Obama largely is a failure. But the Iran deal has already gone forward. All of these other nations are already on board with it. The Israelis have this strange paranoid delusion that anybody that criticizes Israel, regardless on what basis they're criticizing it, is a neo-Nazi. Are you telling me that the governments and people of most nations in this world, regardless of region, are Nazis? To hear them talk, you would think that the Third Reich won the Second World War. Well, clearly it didn't. Clearly the Western powers won the Second World War. Yet they have this delusion. Even if Iran were to obtain nuclear weapons, it's not going to use them against Israel. Because it would be suicidal. First, the Israelis would nuke them. Secondly, the United States would nuke them. The Russians would turn their back on the Iranians at that point. Nobody would be their friend. They'd be a pariah state. Everybody fucking knows this. The nuclear deal with Iran is designed to attempt to assuage the fears of nations like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt that might start their own nuclear programs. But the Israelis appear blind to this because they hate the Iranians so much that they think that if the Iranians so much as get one Davy Crockett, it spells doom for the nation of Israel. I'm sorry, this is not sensible, and to base our politics around a biblical concept at all makes no sense. It makes us look like a laughingstock, for one thing, to most of our allies, that have repeatedly, they've gone to the international community and stressed the importance of a two-state solution, and on cracking down on what they see as essentially limited genocide conducted by the state of Israel, as well as its unwillingness to acknowledge its own nuclear status. And we look like a laughingstock because we've stood in the way of that for decade after decade. Only in the last couple of years has the United States done anything whatsoever to try to kind of crack down on Israeli warmongering. Let me tell you this, by the way. War in Iraq. What did Netanyahu tell our government? What did he tell Bush and all of these others? Told Hillary too, by the way. She voted in favor. What did he tell us? You'll be greeted as liberators. Everybody will love you. The Iraqis will love you. We'll love you. The whole Middle East will be hunky-dory once Saddam's gone. But were they willing to join our coalition and actually fight alongside us? Oh, yeah, sorry, I've got a meeting right now. Does this sound like the actions and behaviors of a U.S. ally? The idea that somebody who is criticizing a state that has such a bipolar mentality is either a Nazi or friendly towards Islamofascism makes no sense. By the way, when the Israelis or when people who support the state of Israel say, oh, well, you must be pro-Islamofascist if you don't like the state of Israel, when they say that, point out this to them. The state of Israel is a buddy with Egypt, that's full of Muslims, Wahhabi Muslims nonetheless, Saudi Arabia, where people routinely get stoned, beaten, raped, and beheaded on a fairly regular basis. Those are Israel's main allies in the region, along with the Jordanians that are a monarchy. They're more secular than the Saudis or the Egyptians are, but certainly, they're Islamists. And yet you're pro-Muslim if you oppose the state of Israel? I think what they mean is pro-Shia. But the thing is, you don't have to like Islam in order to judge Israel on the same basis that you judge the Islamic world. When I look at the Islamic world, I see lots of war, attempts to develop WMDs, certainly. Certainly, Assad does have chemical weapons. Has he used them against his own people? I think jury's still out on that. I personally don't believe it. But he certainly does have chemical stockpiles. ISIS, yeah, they've managed to get a hold of radiological material. They probably have primitive chemical weapons as well, let's face it. I'm sure that they want them if they don't have them. Yeah, the Islamic world is full of violence. The Islamic world is full of racism and imperialism. Imperialism has been one of the rudiments and tenets of Islam for hundreds of years. But the Israeli state acts the same way. Now, this doesn't make sense because supposedly when people prop up the state of Israel in their arguments, they say, well, the only democracy in the Middle East, only secular society in the Middle East, people vote there, women have rights, gays have rights, and so forth. But they're acting about the same. What about that stabbing at the gay pride parade there? The funny thing is, the same evangelicals that'll trot out the argument, oh, well, they're so much better than the Muslims, they don't kill gay people over there, then we're cheering when this happened. It was actually rather funny. You saw it from several of these evangelicals and evangelical groups. The state of Israel has nothing whatsoever to do with the Bible anyway. If you actually read your Bible, you'll find the map is all wrong. The policies are all wrong. The religious philosophies are all wrong. Even the tribe that happens to be dominant in their government is all wrong. It doesn't make any sense. It's not the biblical state of Israel. It's just a political enclave carved out of mandatory Palestine by the British Empire. That's what the modern state of Israel is. It's a rogue nuclear state that hasn't signed the NPT. It has conducted mass espionage on the United States and probably most of our allies. It has taken our nuclear materials, stolen them. It developed nuclear weapons with little to no oversight. It's attacked our vessels before. Does this sound like how an ally acts? And then after giving them hundreds of billions of dollars of aid, free weapons, and overlooking all the other stuff they've done, they dare to say there's something wrong with the Iran deal and try to stand in the way of it? The only reason why there are people in D.C. who are standing against the Iran deal right now is because of the hyper-partisan mannerisms of idiot Obama, who has largely disenfranchised himself to the American public. If Obama were more popular, this would not be happening. Unfortunately, Obama's an idiot too. The Iran deal may be fundamentally a good idea, although who cares if there's any deal at all? The Israeli intelligence services themselves, who are acutely aware of what goes on in Iran and have threatened to assassinate people in Iran at this point as well, go back to assassinating their nuclear scientists. They just threatened to do that a few days ago, by the way, and break some more international laws. They've said themselves, these same intelligence services, oh, Iran can't get a nuke. It's impossible. They don't have the technology to do it. And they don't have any of the setups required to enrich the uranium, let alone create an actual weapon from it, even if they had weaponized uranium. They don't have the capability to do it. The Israeli state already has multi-stage thermonuclear weapons. At least according to the Pentagon, they had them by the 1980s. The Iranians have 0 nuclear weapons. They have to build at least about 50 of them to draw even with Israel, and they have to improve their design. There's a difference between a 20-kiloton atomic warhead that has to be dropped out of a bomber manually and an ICBM containing several 5-megaton warheads. Big difference between the two of them. Many people don't appear to understand this. So as far as the Israeli state goes, I would say, no, they're not a U.S. ally. They never have been. They're a strategic partner, they're a trading partner, but largely they exist to apparently get our free money. And we need to stop funding them. We need to hold them accountable. We know they have nuclear weapons. The Pentagon report got FOIA'd. It's now public. We know they have nuclear weapons. Ambiguity is over. As a result, they need to sign the NPT, or it is against U.S. law to send them any sort of aid. Yet we're still sending them aid, violating our own laws. I wonder why. See, it makes no sense. We don't hold them to any form of standard. Like we would even... The British couldn't get away with half of what the Israelis do. And they've traditionally been one of our strongest allies. They also have a much bigger economy. They have nuclear weapons. They signed the NPT. They've still got 180 warheads. The French, they got 300 warheads. They signed the NPT. Nobody worries about the French suddenly invading or nuking them. Nobody worries about the UK doing it. Nobody even worries about the Chinese doing it for the most part, outside of a few nations that happen to share a land border with them. The Israelis are sort of the bane of their region. Everyone's constantly worried about getting nuked by them unless they suck up. That essentially means Egypt and Saudi Arabia. The Saudis give them weapons and all sorts of aid too. They're not a U.S. ally, folks. I hate to burst your bubble. They never have been. The idea that we're a shining Christian city on a hill and Israel is the chosen land of the Jewish people, and we get along so well because we're linked by some common biblical theme, it wouldn't even make sense anyway. The Jews don't even believe in Jesus Christ. According to your own Bible, apparently they're all going to hell. Well, how is this the chosen people of God? It just doesn't make sense. Get real, people. Live in your Bible fantasy land all you want. Is that a proper way to conduct diplomacy, foreign affairs, and so forth? Probably not, because it makes us look retarded to most of our allies. They're beginning to wonder about our mental state as a result of our undying support of a nation that has nuclear weapons outside the NPT and has stolen from us repeatedly, committed espionage on us, that repeatedly bombs civilians in Gaza and attempts to settle chunks of the West Bank that do not belong to them. So yes, that's essentially the real state of our relationship with Israel. Now, I fully expect there'll be a few shills on this video. I don't give a fuck anymore. Other people can fucking debate them, because it gets tiring, because you post sources for them, they read them, they pretend to ignore them, then when confronted with them again, they say, oh, they'll try to change the subject. The next day they'll pretend like they made all sorts of great points and you had absolutely nothing. I had one idiot do this on some other video for fucking months. Literally months. Months went by. He was still ranting about the issue. Now he's ranting to somebody else. I gave up. I said, well, anybody that's interested in the subject is going to see this comment thread. It's like fucking 500 comments long. They can go through all this shit. I'm done with this fuck. So yeah, there's our relationship with Israel. It's basically non-existent. They're not an ally. If anything, they're an enemy. When you really think about it, they haven't signed the NPT. If any other state did that, we'd declare them part of the axis of evil. What's the difference? I fail to see one. That's about all. Peace out.